Why avoidants can't break the bond with you, even after leaving. They left, but they never really left, because an avoidant does not detach the way they pretend to. They only distance the body while the mind stays tied to the emotional imprint you created inside them, and that is the truth. No one tells you when you are trying to understand why an avoidant still watches your stories, remembers your words, compares every new person to you, and feels restless in silence. Because avoidants are not built to erase bonds, they are built to suppress them. And suppression is not freedom, it is a prison made of denial. And when you were in their life, you did not just exist as a partner, you became a reference point, a mirror, a safety signal, a threat to their emotional defenses, and a reminder of what intimacy feels like. Which is exactly why they had to leave, not because the bond was weak, but because it was too strong for the emotional armor they were wearing. And that is why even after walking away, they carry you inside like a hidden scar, because every deep connection an avoidant forms becomes part of their internal world, and they may say they moved on, but inside they replay moments, conversations, feelings, and versions of themselves that only existed with you. And what makes this bond unbreakable is not love alone, it is unfinished emotional business, because avoidants rarely resolve feelings. They postpone them, they delay them, they bury them under logic and independence. But buried emotions do not die, they only wait. And when the world gets quiet, when no one is watching, when the night gets heavy, that bond wakes up inside them like a whisper saying you mattered. And the avoidant hates that voice because it reminds them that they are not as detached as they pretend to be. And the reason they cannot break the bond with you is because you saw them in a way they struggle to see themselves. You saw their softness behind their distance, their fear behind their confidence, their need behind their independence. And when someone witnesses your hidden self, that connection becomes permanent, because now a part of you lives in their memory as the person who almost made them feel safe, and that almost is more painful than anything else, because it represents a life they could have lived emotionally but were too afraid to choose. And this is why avoidants often romanticize the past silently, not openly, not dramatically, but privately, quietly, in moments they would never admit. And when they try to love someone new, they do not start from zero, they start from comparison. And in that comparison you still exist, not as a person, but as a feeling, a standard, a memory of connection that still carries emotional weight. And that is why they sometimes reach out unexpectedly, not because they want to return, but because the bond is tugging at them from inside. And they need reassurance that you still exist in some form. Because the idea that you have completely moved on threatens their sense of emotional control. And avoidants fear being the one who is forgotten more than they fear being alone, because being forgotten means the bond was never real. And deep down they know it was real. And that is what makes it impossible to fully detach. And you must understand something important here. The bond you created was not just about romance, it was about emotional impact. You challenged their emotional patterns. You disrupted their comfort zone. You made them feel things they had learned to avoid. And when someone breaks your emotional routine, they become unforgettable. Not because of what they gave you, but because of what they awakened inside you. And for an avoidant, emotional awakening feels like danger and desire at the same time, which is why they run and remember you in the same breath. And even if they act cold, logical, distant, or indifferent, their nervous system remembers you. Their body remembers the emotional safety and emotional risk you represented. And this is why they can't fully let go, because letting go would mean admitting they were vulnerable with you. And vulnerability is the one thing avoidants struggle to accept in themselves. And when they leave, they often tell themselves stories like, you were too emotional, too intense, too demanding, too complicated. But those stories are not about you, they are about their fear of closeness. And over time those stories weaken, because memory softens pain and strengthens longing. And slowly the mind starts remembering your kindness, your patience, your laughter, your presence, and the bond grows quieter but deeper, like a river under frozen ground, still moving, still alive. And this is why you feel them even when they are gone, because emotional bonds are not maintained by contact, they are maintained by unresolved attachment. And unresolved attachment is the strongest form of connection, because it leaves questions unanswered, feelings unexpressed, and possibilities unfinished. And the avoidant mind lives in unfinished business, because it avoids emotional closure, and without closure, bonds do not end, they only pause, and you are not just a chapter to them, you are a question mark, and question marks do not disappear, they wait for answers, and even if they never come back to you, the bond still shapes how they love, how they leave, how they protect themselves, and how they remember connection. And this is why you should never measure the bond by their actions alone, because avoidants express attachment through absence more than presence, through silence more than words, through distance more than closeness, and the more meaningful the bond, the more they struggle to stay. and the more they struggle to forget, and this is the painful paradox of loving an avoidant, they detach from what matters most, and then spend their life trying to emotionally outrun the memory of it. And if you ever wondered whether you truly mattered to them, understand this. If they still think of you, compare others to you, feel triggered by your growth, or feel uncomfortable when they imagine you happy without them, then the bond is not broken. It is only hidden. And the truth is, avoidants do not break bonds. They bury them. And buried bonds have a way of returning when the heart is finally tired of running. And this is why even after leaving, a part of them still belongs to you. Not because they chose it, but because emotional truth does not ask permission. It simply stays. And in the next part, you will understand exactly how this hidden bond influences their future relationships, their emotional patterns, and the moment they finally realize what they lost. Even when they appear happy without you, even when they seem calm, successful, or emotionally untouched, the bond with you still lives quietly inside them, because avoidants do not erase emotional memories. They store them in the background of their identity, and every time they feel closeness with someone new, your shadow appears as a comparison they never asked for. Because the nervous system remembers emotional intensity more than logic remembers reasons, and that is why they may tell themselves they are over you, but their body reacts when they hear your name, see someone who looks like you, or feel a moment that reminds them of what they once shared with you. And this reaction is not about desire alone, it is about unresolved attachment. And unresolved attachment is stronger than active love, because love can end with understanding, but attachment only ends with emotional integration. And avoidants rarely integrate emotions. They compartmentalize them, and when emotions are compartmentalized, they stay frozen in time. And that means to the avoidant, you are not part of the past, you are part of a paused emotional timeline, and that is why they can't fully move forward without sometimes looking back, not physically but emotionally. And you may never know how of. They think about you because avoidants process privately, silently, and without witnesses, and their inner world is far more emotional than their outer behavior ever shows. And when they left you, they did not leave because they stopped feeling, they left because they felt too much without knowing how to hold it safely. And that fear of emotional responsibility is what makes the bond with you so complicated, because you represent both comfort and threat in their memory. And that duality keeps the bond alive, because the mind keeps revisiting what feels unfinished, and what was unfinished with you was not the relationship itself, but their emotional courage, and every time they fail to open fully with someone else, they remember the version of themselves they almost became with you, and that almost becomes heavier than any goodbye, and avoidants are haunted more by who they could have been than by who they lost, and that is why the bond with you stays alive inside their identity, because you symbolize an emotional evolution they resisted. And when life gets difficult, when they feel lonely, misunderstood, or emotionally disconnected, your memory becomes a silent refuge, not because you were perfect, but because you were real to them in a way they rarely allow. And this is why they may check your social media, ask about you through others, or think about reaching out and then stop themselves, because the bond pulls them forward while fear pulls them back, and they live in that tension. And that tension keeps the bond active, because emotional tension is a form of attachment energy, and attachment energy does not disappear, it only changes shape. And sometimes it becomes nostalgia, sometimes regret, sometimes curiosity, sometimes emotional pain disguised as indifference. And this is why you should not confuse their silence with emotional closure, because silence is often an avoidance way of protecting a bond they do not know how to express. And when they imagine you with someone else, the bond tightens, because now the emotional story has a new threat. And that threat forces them to feel what they tried to avoid. And this is when avoidants often realize the depth of what they lost, not when you were there, but when you are no longer emotionally available to them. And this is the moment the bond becomes fully conscious inside them, because loss activates attachment more than presence ever could, and that is why many avoidants suddenly feel drawn back when you detach emotionally, because the bond was never about control, it was about emotional security, and when that security is truly gone, the nervous system panics, and they start questioning their decisions, their identity, and their emotional logic. And yet, even in this realization, many avoidants still do not return, because returning would require vulnerability, accountability, and emotional growth, and those things are harder than missing someone, and so they carry the bond quietly instead, letting it shape their emotional future in invisible ways. And this is why they sometimes choose emotionally unavailable partners later, because it feels familiar, it feels safer, and it protects them from feeling the intensity they once felt with you. And in that protection, Your bond becomes the emotional line they never cross again. And you become the emotional ceiling of their life, the deepest connection they ever allowed themselves to experience. And even if they never say it, even if they never admit it, that bond becomes part of their personal history, part of how they define love, part of how they understand intimacy, and part of how they fear it. And you must understand something powerful here. The bond does not keep you tied to them. It keeps them tied to the version of themselves they were with you, and that is why you should not wait for them, chase them, or hope for their return. Because the bond is already doing its work inside them without your effort, and your task is not to reopen the bond, but to honor what it meant and move forward with emotional dignity. Because when you heal, the bond transforms from pain into wisdom, and when they remember you, they will remember not just what they lost, but what they were not ready to become. And in the next part, you will understand how this hidden bond eventually turns into emotional regret, growth, or emotional repetition in their future relationships. As time moves forward, the bond with you does not fade, it evolves. Because emotional memory does not operate on clocks, it operates on meaning. And what had meaning with you becomes part of the avoidant's emotional identity, shaping how they see themselves in relationships long after the relationship has ended. And this is why they may forget details about arguments, problems, or misunderstandings. But they never forget how you made them feel in the moments when they almost felt emotionally safe. Because safety is the rarest emotional experience for an avoidant, and anything rare becomes unforgettable. And when they build new connections, they do so with invisible emotional limits. Limits created the moment they lost you, because losing you taught them that intimacy leads to discomfort, and comfort leads to vulnerability. And vulnerability leads to emotional exposure, and emotional exposure feels dangerous to their nervous system. So instead of breaking the bond, they turn it into a silent, emotional rule that says, never go that deep again. And that rule does not erase you, it immortalizes you as the deepest point they ever reached. And this is why the bond becomes stronger in distance than it ever was in presence. Because distance allows idealization, and idealization allows the mind to rewrite emotional history into something softer, purer, and more emotionally powerful. And now you are not just a person in their memory, you are a symbol of what real connection could feel like, and that symbol follows them into every future relationship like an invisible standard. And even when they try to emotionally detach, they cannot detach from the comparison, because comparison is how the mind keeps attachment alive. And the more they compare, the more the bond stabilizes inside their identity. And this is why avoidants often feel emotionally bored in new relationships, not because the new person is uninteresting, but because the emotional depth does not match the unresolved bond they still carry with you. And boredom is often just grief in disguise, and grief for avoidance does not look like tears. It looks like emotional numbness, restlessness, and quiet dissatisfaction. And they may not consciously connect this to you, but the emotional root is the same. Because the bond with you represents emotional intensity they no longer allow themselves to experience. And every time they choose emotional distance, they are choosing safety over connection. And safety keeps them alive, but connection is what makes them feel human. And that internal conflict keeps the bond with you emotionally active. Because you represent the moment they almost chose connection. And that almost stays with them more than any success or failure ever could. And this is why avoidants sometimes dream about you not as you were but as you felt. Because dreams are not about people, they are about emotional states. And the emotional state you represented becomes a recurring emotional memory, and this memory influences how they treat love, commitment, and vulnerability. And sometimes, years later, when they finally mature emotionally, they look back and understand the bond in a new way, not as a loss but as a lesson. And in that moment, the bond becomes even deeper. Because now it is attached to growth, and growth creates gratitude mixed with regret. And regret is one of the strongest emotional anchors the human mind can hold, and this is why avoidants often regret more than they admit, because admitting regret requires emotional honesty. And emotional honesty threatens their self-image of independence and strength, and so they keep it quiet. But quiet regret is still regret, and quiet bonds are still bonds. And even if they never return to you, they often wish they had been a different version of themselves with you. And that wish keeps you emotionally alive inside them, and this is why you may feel a strange sense of closure without closure. Because emotional connections do not always end with conversations. They end when meaning is integrated, and for avoidants, meaning takes a long time to integrate. Because they resist emotional reflection, and that resistance delays emotional closure, and delayed closure is exactly what keeps the bond unbroken. And you must understand that the bond with you is not a chain that holds you back, it is a mirror that shows them who they were not ready to become. And every time they avoid vulnerability in the future, they silently remember you. Because you are the emotional reference point they never fully released. And this is why your role in their life is far bigger than a relationship. You are part of their emotional evolution, whether they like it or not, and whether they ever admit it or not. And in the next part, you will understand how this bond finally transforms when an avoidant reaches emotional awareness, and what that moment truly means for both of you. When an avoidant finally reaches emotional awareness, the bond with you does not disappear. It changes its role inside their life. Because awareness does not delete memory, it gives memory meaning. And meaning is what turns emotional pain into emotional truth. And in that moment, they no longer see you only as someone they lost, but as someone who revealed their emotional limitations. And this realization is both painful and liberating, because now they must face the part of themselves they spent years avoiding. The part that wanted closeness, tenderness, emotional honesty, and connection. And this is why emotional awareness feels heavy for an avoidant, because it forces them to accept that the bond was not broken by circumstance, distance, or incompatibility, but by fear. And fear is harder to forgive than fate, and once they see this, the bond with you becomes a symbol of accountability. And accountability is something avoidants struggle with more than attachment itself, because accountability means admitting they had a choice, and they chose emotional safety over emotional depth. And this is why the bond with you often becomes the emotional turning point of their life. Because no other connection challenged their emotional structure the same way, and no other memory forces them to reflect on who they were and who they could have been. And at this stage, they may finally feel true grief, not for the relationship, but for the version of themselves they abandoned when they walked away from you. And that grief is quiet, private, and deeply personal. And it does not always lead them back to you, but it always leads them back to the emotional truth of the bond. And they may wish they had loved you better, spoken more honestly, stayed more present, or been braver with their heart. And those wishes keep the bond alive in a softer but deeper form, because now it is no longer driven by fear, but by understanding. And understanding is what makes emotional connections timeless. And this is why some avoidants think about you years later with a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. Because you were not just a partner, you were a lesson in emotional courage. And even if they never contact you again, you live inside their emotional story as the person who showed them what real connection required, and what they were not ready to give. And for you, the bond transforms too, because once you stop waiting for their return, you begin to understand your own strength, your own depth, and your own capacity for love. And the bond no longer hurts the same way, it becomes a quiet confide. That you were capable of creating something meaningful, and that meaning was real even if the relationship did not last. And this is the final truth about avoidance and bonds. They do not break bonds, they transform them into emotional landmarks, and you become one of those landmarks in their life. A place their heart remembers even when their mind tries to move forward. And whether they grow from it or repeat it, the bond with you remains part of their emotional architecture, shaping how they love, how they leave, and how they remember. And the most powerful part of this story is that you are no longer defined by whether they come back, because the bond has already fulfilled its purpose by showing you that you are capable of deep connection, and by showing them that deep connection requires courage. And that is why even after leaving, even after silence, even after time, the bond between you and an avoidant is never truly broken. It simply changes form, living quietly in memory, in meaning, and in the emotional truth that neither of you can fully erase.